Okay, in this presentation, we're going to be looking at the role and the mechanism of visual perception. Our interest is to unpack the idea that how we think about the world is intimately bound up with how we see it, and vice versa. Everything I'm going to talk about today in visual perception really applies to all the senses, but visual perception is the most um, easy to demonstrate, and it is one of our key sensory modalities as it takes up the lion's share of energy in our brain. So we begin by looking at visual perception. There are two basic aspects to it, the physical and the cultural. We might think of this as the hardware and the software. Okay, what we're born genetically, what we have, the structure of our brains and eyes, and the nature of the physics of light in the world, and then cultural conceptions, social ideas, all the stuff that we download into our brain. So we're going to start with the physical perception. In part two, we're going to be looking at the social cultural aspects. Essentially, there are three parts to perception. In other words, what we see of the world relies on three things. One, the objects in the world. Two, the actual structure and mechanism in the eye. And three, the most important part, which is the brain. Now, when we think about perception, for most people, this is a fairly commonsensical idea of how things work. In other words, you wake up in the morning, you open your eyes, and the world jumps in. The sounds come to you, the smells come to you, the images come to you of the room, the door, the floor, the wall, whatever. You're essentially receptive to the stimuli of the world. Now, this is true on one level. True in the sense that our eye is like a camera. It's got a chamber that's empty with a lens, and at the back of that chamber, a camera might have film, or it's a digital camera, a CDC array. In the eye, we have a special kind of film called a retina. So at the very first level of perception, it's true that the eye is very much like a camera. But that's really not what we see. So I'm going to demonstrate this to you because the retina is actually composed of nerve cells. In other words, the brain is right there at the very beginning of the stimuli coming into the eye. And so to demonstrate that, I want you to experience the difference between stimuli and perception. Essentially, stimuli is what hits our eyes. It's the dots of light, the photons that bounce off the world. Perception is the way we structure and organize that to make meaning. Do we see objects? Do we see people? Do we see expressions? Can we see things that are hidden? How do we take this information and make it meaningful? Now, the two things are distinct, and this next slide will demonstrate that. Okay, so what we have here is an image. And what I'd like you to do in a second is pause the presentation and try and figure out what you're looking at. Okay, so let's do that for a second. Okay, so I'm assuming you've come back to the image. You probably are having a hard time making sense of this, and that's because all you're able to do is register the stimuli. It's just a bunch of dark and light patches, and you probably came up with a whole variety of things, but the answer is actually quite simple. It's a cow's head, and it's looking straight at you. So this is the head of the cow. Here is the nose. These are the two eyes. This is the ear, the other ear of the cow. This is the body of the cow. And this is a fence in the background. So now that I say that, you probably go, aha, I see it. And now it's impossible not to see it. In other words, what you had before was just pure stimuli, just seeing patches of light and dark. What you have now is your brain has made sense of that. It's put it all together and it's made a picture. Now, this is crucial because what we're talking about is actually perception. That is that meaning-making process that we go through when we look at things. And so one of the things I hope to demonstrate in this short presentation is that how we actually see the world could be better diagrammed a little bit more like this. In other words, we go into the world and we edit, we rearrange, we select what we want to see, we select how we see it. And this is fairly important because it's so counterintuitive. We think that what we are looking at is actually what is there. And so I encourage you, if you want further demonstration of this, to take an art class. Especially a class where you're learning to draw or paint realistically. What you think you see in front of you is not exactly what's there, And the trick and the key to learning how to draw and paint is learning how to see what's there. So let's look at some of these things that perception in the eyes, some of the tricks and games that it plays with us. So one of the things is we can easily see things that are not there. So this is an active property of the mind where we make things up. All right, so for example, we'll start with this simple image. Many of you will see a white triangle in this image, but if we think about it, there's really no white triangle. This is a white background with 3 black Pac-Man and 3 angular shapes. They're just arranged in such a way that we begin to see this other form. This has something known as closure that our brains and eyes are particularly good at in terms of perception. Or this. You look at these 2 orange circles, we think of them as being different sizes. They're actually the same size. So what you're seeing is something that's not there. You're seeing difference. You're seeing a larger circle on the right than on the left, whereas in actual fact, it's not the case. Or these 2 dogs. If we look at these 2 dogs, they look different. But if I take the background out, they're exactly the same dog. Put the background back in, and we have 2 different dogs. Okay. We go to this next image. You probably will see this thing vibrating, but there's no vibration there. In fact, you could print this presentation out, take a screenshot, print it out, and on a piece of paper, it will still vibrate. All right. So again, you're seeing something that doesn't exist. You're essentially hallucinating. Or how about this one? We look at these 2 tabletops. This top and this top look different. But if you believe that they were different, you'd be mistaken. They're exactly the same. Again, what you're seeing is difference. So let me demonstrate that by putting a red line around the top of this table and then shifting it over, rotating it into place, sliding it down, and voila. And you can see they're the same. So why is this? How come we're prone to be deceived like this? Well, it's not a shortcoming of our perceptual system. It's actually not. And that's because our perceptual system is not designed to represent the world faithfully. We're not trying to copy what's out there and give that information to our brain. Unfortunately, or rather fortunately, what we see, what we perceive, is what our brain needs to see or thinks we should see in order to survive properly in the world. So let me show you how this might work. So if we look at these 2 red lines, right, it might appear to you that the one on the right is taller than the one on the left, but they're exactly the same. So we do this, you can see they're the same height, same thickness, same everything. So why do they look so different? Well, they look different not because our eyes are deceived, but rather because our eyes are telling us the truth. If we encountered this situation in the world, a wall like this that went back in space and another wall, this piece right here would be significantly bigger. In fact, 3 times the size of this. In other words, our brain is telling us what is the truth about the world, not what's hitting our eyes. We might see this in the real world, but we would not be fooled into thinking they're the same size. Even if when they hit our eyeball, they are the same size, they're not in real life. Or how about this one? You might believe that you're seeing red, but there is in fact no red in this image. Right? These strawberries are actually gray. Okay, so let me just, there's the actual gray that I've taken out of Photoshop to sort of demonstrate this to you, and I'll give you another. So you see they blend into that gray. So why are they gray? Well, because our brain's looking at the situation and it's decoding the information, and it says, I'm looking at this scene through a blue-green filter. Okay, so it knows that. So if what hits our eye is gray, which our brain knows it's gray, then what is causing that gray has to be red. In other words, if you see gray through a blue-green filter, you're looking at a red object. All right, because the blue-green cancels out the red, which is why we're getting gray. So our brain knows what we're seeing, but it's not trying to tell us what we see. It's trying to tell us what's there. In other words, so we can survive and get through in the world and know that these strawberries are actually edible and ripe, rather than looking at gray strawberries, which we might pass up. Okay, so we can see that what we perceive in the world is structured. It's active. We're taking the information, or rather our brain is, and we're playing with it. We're redesigning it to make sense. Here's another example, the Adelson checkerboard, one of the most famous. A and B are the same gray. There's no difference between these two. And if I show you here, you can see these gray bars. Where we can't see the boundaries is because they're the same. Now, again, this is not because we're fooled or we're tricked. It's because in the real world, even if these were the same hitting our eye, the same gray, which they are, we would know that they're actually different. So what we perceive is really based on what we know, not on what actually hits our eyes. Okay, so that's one half of the equation. But not only do we see things that are, we see things that are not there, we also don't see things that are there. Okay, so things can be right in front of us and we won't observe it. So let's start with this. All right, here's a sentence. And what I want you to do in this sentence is I want you to count how many F's are in the sentence above. So take a minute, pause the presentation, and just have a look at this sentence. When you think you know what the answer is, start the presentation again. Okay, so you probably figured out the correct number, and hopefully that correct number is 6. 6, will you ask? Many people say 3, 4, 5, but very few people say 6. Why is that? Because the word of is not registered. Okay, when we read, we do not read by letters. We read in context. We just scan and glance, and if we see something, we decode what it means without breaking it down into its pieces. And the word of is particularly one of those words that we scan super fast and very quickly. The FedEx logo. I'm sure many of you know this, but there's a surprising number of people who've never encountered it before. What I mean by that is not encountered the logo, but rather not encountered the secret symbol that's hiding in the FedEx logo. So in other words, there is something in here, a symbol put there by the designer, to make you think at a subconscious level about the company FedEx. So again, stop this if you want to see if you can locate it. Okay, so hopefully you found it by now, and there it is. It's the white arrow put there by the company to give you a subconscious impression that FedEx is about movement, because we read from right to left, and that movement is heading towards the future, again, because we go from right to left. Now, interestingly, if your language was read in the other direction, like Arabic, it would look different. And here's the Arabic FedEx logo, and you can see the arrow right there. You also could see it more easily because unless you speak Arabic, those letters don't make any sense to you. In other words, we just see them as shapes because we haven't given them meaning. So the problem with meaning is that it speeds things up, it makes life more efficient, but it also closes us down because we're not aware of a lot of things that are happening in there because we've decided we already know what it is. Not so much with this image, but with the FedEx. That's a separate issue we're going to come to a little bit later, but we'll just keep moving. And here's just a couple of fun things about people using the space around words and letters to have a bit of fun. You see the smiley face and goodwill. This is quite clever. Ed's Electric. Or we come down to Black Cat. All right, so another thing about perception is that we have 3 special cells in our eyes which allow us to see color. All right. Each cell picks up a different range of colors. So here's human. Here's the spectrum right here. And you can see we have one cell that focuses mostly on this part of the spectrum, one cell which focuses on the middle, one cell which focuses on what's called the shortwave end of the spectrum. People say these are blue, green, and red light frequencies, but that's not true. A, they're overlapped, and B, the red is actually in the green if you come straight down, and the green is closer to middle green. So there is no red necessarily. The color itself is much more complicated. But anyway, we have 3 cells in our eyes, and that allows us to perceive color in this range. Now, if we look at another animal, in this case a pigeon, you'll notice there's a fourth. And that fourth one allows color to be seen down here in the ultraviolet range. We can't see in the ultraviolet range. Yeah, these are very low, very weak. It's not up here. So pigeons have an extra cell. They have 4 cells in their eyes. And so not only do they see what we see, but they see a little bit more. Now, the number of photoreceptors that a animal or non-human animal or human has tells us how much they can see in terms of color. So dolphins, for instance, they're known as monochromats. They only have one, so essentially they don't see any colors. Big cats and dogs are dichromats. They have 2, and they can see about 10,000 colors. Humans, we see roughly 1,000,000 colors. We can't name them all, but our eye is designed to see it. But when we come to birds, like we just saw with pigeons, they have 4, and some birds and some butterflies have 5. So not only can they see 100 million colors if you go up by 1 more cell, but if you go up by 2 more, we're in the 10 billion range. So in other words, there's a lot more color out there that we just simply cannot see. Color blindness in humans is actually a result of that. So if you are colorblind, it means one of those receptors is not working. And so for a person with 3 receptors, this is what you might see. There are 3 types of color blindness. We are either missing one receptor here or the other receptor or the other receptor. And you can see the limited range of colors that people can see. You can think of it like paint tubes. If you have 3 tubes of paint, you can make a lot of colors. If you have 2 tubes of paint, you have a limited range of colors. All right, so how do we test for color blindness? Well, something known as the Ishihara color blindness test is the standard in the business. And so we look at this. If you are unable to see the number 8 in the middle of this, then you probably have color blindness of some degree. And let's remember that color blindness also is a matter of degree. It's not total or complete. Or here, this is known as a test for anomalous trichromacy. If you can't see the number in here, then again, you might consider having your eyes tested because you're colorblind in some area. Actually, I'm just playing a joke on you. There is no number in here, but just making sure you're on your toes. All right, so when it comes to seeing things, if we go back to the bird and butterfly idea, what a butterfly can see is very different than a human. So we might see flowers that look like this and a butterfly that looks like that, but if you can see an ultraviolet, you will see this other color on the edges of the petals, this other color within the top wings. Now we don't know what that color is, but we know it's there because we have cameras that can detect ultraviolet. All right, so this is taken with an ultraviolet camera, as is this image. Again, we can see that there are other colors happening on these flower petals that creatures other than ourselves are able to see. And then there's the curious case of the mantis shrimp. This little guy has 11 to 12 cones, so he's up in the gazillion range of colors. Why that's the case, nobody really knows. Anyway, so what conclusions can we draw from all of this? Well, we know that our physical perception is limited. There's a lot more out there than we can see. We can't take it all in. We don't have the hardware to be able to detect it all. But most importantly, our perception is active. It makes meaning so that we can survive. It is not a passive receptor. It's not designed to represent an accurate picture of the world. So that concludes the physical aspect of perception in part 1. When we come back in part 2, we're going to be looking at the cultural and conceptual influences and how that also has a dramatic effect on how we see.